Good afternoon, everyone. I should say good morning. This is Mark Schindler, Executive Director of the Justice Policy Institute. I'm thrilled to be with all of you, welcoming you to the third and final panel for our two-day symposium on what is really a historic sort of happening that we're looking forward to in the district, which is the rewrite of the district's criminal code. As I said, we're the third and closing panel. Hopefully all of you or many of you got to enjoy yesterday's kickoff panel featuring James Foreman, an incredible group of speakers with local attorneys and law professors. We just heard a really, I thought, fascinating discussion amongst advisory members of the Criminal Code Reform Commission, going deep in the weeds on the recommendations that are being made to the council and the mayor. And now in our closing panel, we are joined by really incredible group of folks that I'm going to welcome and introduce in just a moment to step back a little bit and look forward. So we're going to raise up a little bit, maybe not so much in the weeds as the advisory council members, although we do have people on this panel who are incredibly knowledgeable about the details of the code and the recommendations, but also looking at this big picture and looking forward about what this process means for the district and also for the country. The district has a chance to lead in this respect. And so I'm looking forward to a really terrific conversation. Before I introduce our panelists, I just want to share a couple of comments for folks who either saw yesterday's panel or didn't. It's recorded and will be available on the CCRC website. And we were thrilled to have James Foreman Jr. open it up. Many of you know James, the former PDS attorney and now Pulitzer Prize-winning author and professor at Yale University at the law school. James joined us and really, I think, put this moment in context. He talked about the book that he wrote, Locking Up Our Own, that talked about how the district got to a very punitive justice system, or some would say injustice system, that really causes incredible harm to communities, particularly Black and Brown communities here in the district, not unlike in many places around the country. I thought James really framed it well when he talked about what happened back in the 90s, particularly. And he said that though people were trying to do the right thing in some ways, that they lacked imagination. They couldn't think of better responses at that time. And he talked about prison being the least creative response to solve community problems, right? And so the changes that were put in place back in the 90s, really we've seen the impact on our community since then. And he did talk, though, sort of looking forward about where we are now and how it's a moment where we can do better, where we can be creative, we can imagine a better way. Where incarceration rates in the district, both on the youth and adult side, have come down dramatically in the last 10 to 20 years, but they're still far too high. And as Laura Hankins said in the panel just preceding, though the city has changed and diversified, our justice system has not. We still lock up almost exclusively Black people and poor Black people, right? And so while we need to imagine a new way, and think about what can be done better, that's the task upon us. And so I'm thrilled today to have a group of folks with us. It would take me quite a while to go through their full bios. They'll be available online. But let me quickly introduce. We're joined by Paul Butler. Paul is the Albert Brick Professor in Law at Georgetown University Law Center. He's also a legal analyst on MSNBC, and you can see him just about any time you turn on a TV these days. He's one of the nation's most frequently consulted scholars on issues of race and criminal justice. And he served as a council member, commission member, appointed by the DC City Council. So he wasn't part of the last panel, but we have his brilliance and expertise on this panel. And as Richard noted, he's the author of Chokehold: Policing Black Men, which the New York Times described as the best book on criminal justice reform since the new Jim Crow. He's also a former federal prosecutor, and I welcome Paul. We're also joined by Parissa Degani-Tafti, prosecutor from our neighboring jurisdiction in Arlington. She's the Commonwealth's attorney for Arlington and City of Falls Church. She comes to the office with a 20-year record of criminal justice reform as an innocence protection attorney, a public defender, and a law professor. She served as the legal director for the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project, where she did amazing work. She's immigrated to the United States with her parents as a young child, and she talks about being committed to fair prosecutorial practices that promotes both safety and justice, and believes that the measures of safety and the quality of justice we receive should not depend on where we live, who we love, the dollars in our bank accounts, the color of our skin, or which citizenship papers we hold or don't hold. So welcome, Parissa. I'm thrilled to be joined by my friend and colleague, Halim Flowers. Halim is an American artist, writer, activist, and ambassador for Represent Justice. I first met Halim a number of years ago while he was serving as a mentor in the DC City Jail, DC Jail's Young Men Emerging Unit, where he was impacting young lives every day. I think many of you are familiar with Halim, who was incarcerated as a teen here in the district, sentenced to 40 years to life. And if not for changes in district law, he likely would have still been incarcerated. He'll talk more about the amazing things he's doing now. I could go on and on. I will direct you to his website, to his Instagram account, and to his art page, which we will provide links to in the chat, and you can see more about what Halim is up to. He's received an Halcyon Arts Lab Fellowship, an Echoing Green Fellowship since being returned to the community, and is just doing amazing things. So I'm always just honored to be in Halim's presence and look forward to his sharing his wisdom. And of course, last but hardly least, Patrice Sultan has joined us. Patrice is the founder and executive director of the DC Justice Lab, which I think folks are hearing lots about recently, which is doing amazing and terrific work. She's an attorney who specializes in criminal defense and civil rights. And for more than 15 years, she's worked to advance racial justice in the courts and alongside community-based movements in DC. Patrice has a unique perspective on these issues. She worked for a number of years as a senior attorney advisor on the Criminal Code Reform Commission. So much of what has come out of the commission is due to Patrice's good work, excellent work, I would say. And so we thank her for that. She also is a former practicing lawyer here in the district. So she knows the courtrooms and the judges and knows what it takes to practice here. And she has too many things that I could talk about in terms of her background. She's served on many boards. She's been named a rising star by Super Lawyers Magazine, the Greater Washington Area of the National Bar Association, and the National Law Journal. So I welcome Patrice and all of you to the discussion. I want to jump right in. And as I said, James opened it up and said that when the laws were crafted or changed back in the 90s, we lacked imagination. And I don't think we knew exactly what the impact would be. Now let's look at where we are. Let's look forward. I'm going to start with you, Halim, if I could ask you to take your mic off mute, and others, we'll make this conversational as we go along. Halim, when I think about creativity and imagination, you could be right there in the dictionary next to those words in terms of the work you're doing. You've had personal experience and you have personal expertise as a policy analyst on all these issues. And you've been involved now in activism and justice reform on a big scale. Can you talk a little bit from your perspective, Halim, about why reform of the scale that we're talking about with a rewrite of the criminal code in the district is needed, and what you see as the potential moving forward?
When I think back to my research on the laws in the district where children were being charged as adults, and then the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court stepped in 1966 and stopped the practice or put certain safeguards in place. But then in 1968, we had the Dr. King riots. And after the King riots, US legislators got together and crafted this Title 16 to facilitate, to circumvent the protections that the US Supreme Court put together for juveniles in Kent versus United States in 1966. And in 1970, up until today, we're still charging children as adults. And I say all that to say is that it just was predicated upon fear. And we have a criminal legal system that's impossible to administer justice. That's why I don't say criminal justice reform, because when you take the term criminal in context with the 13th Amendment, that facilitates the perpetuation of slavery for those who've been duly convicted of a crime. So once someone's been duly convicted of a crime and deemed a criminal, I think it's impossible for us to attach the word justice to them when we still allow such egregious practice as slavery to be attached to a human being because they've been convicted of a crime. So we've always begun from like a space of fear. And the reason why the reform of these laws is so important, because we have to begin with a place of love. You can't protect and serve the public or anyone if you don't love them. We're afraid to say the word, but it's definitely going to be needed at this point forward if we're going to even begin to imagine something different. So as an abstract artist, it's easier for me to like abstract from reality and create a new reality, but it all begins from a place of love, and it's definitely love that's needed, and love doesn't make it passive or weak. Rather, love is a dynamic force that's going to make it more stronger and more comprehensive, and not just a quick fix of throwing someone in a cage.
So I so appreciate that framing, Halim. And, you know, I'm proud and encouraged to say here in the district, we've had, as you know, the heads of our juvenile and adult corrections agencies talk a lot about love, right? And talk about how we need to fully integrate that into our system. Patrice, I saw you nodding as Halim was talking. And so my sense is you probably agree with what he said in terms of that larger frame, but you were tasked with sort of turning that big philosophy into statute, right? The work that you did over the last several years. So in some ways, like Halim said, you know, abstract into reality. I wonder if you could talk a little bit, based on your incredibly deep knowledge of the existing code and the recommendations, what do you see as some of the most critical revisions, and what do you expect the impact to be on how this system of, you know, injustice or justice works in the district moving forward? What can we expect if the council moves forward and actually turns these recommendations into law?
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I think you're right. I think James Foreman Jr. was right that a lot of the laws we have from 30, 40 years ago are the result of a lack of imagination, but we still have a lot of laws on the books that are the direct result of explicit racism. I mean, when I traced back the history of some of these statutes, I found myself in the Black codes and the slave codes. And so I think we should be really clear that those laws still exist, and that there are bad intentions that infected the code that we currently have as well. There are some really important changes to the deep end of the system, but I think the bigger impact of the revised code will be felt at the misdemeanor level, because that's oftentimes where there is the most opportunity for civil rights violations and police abuses. Some of the work that I'm most proud of is adding gradations within the offenses that distinguish between different kinds of conduct, different levels of intent, different circumstances, and different results. And just clarifying and making the code more understandable was a really big priority for the commission as well. I worked on a lot of offenses that involved constitutional law issues, both First Amendment and Second Amendment in particular. And there are a lot of criminal statutes on the books that are either facially unconstitutional or have an opportunity for being unconstitutional as applied in many circumstances. So I almost wish that I went back into practice after doing this work, because there's a lot of room for challenging these statutes. So those are the big changes, but there are so many changes in that 3,500 pages of text. It's kind of hard to pick and choose, but those are the biggest changes that I am most excited about.
Well, I appreciate that. And I really appreciate you lifting up some of those statutes that were put in place, 100 years ago. Tyrone Walker talked about that yesterday, when the code was drafted, not long after slavery had been abolished in this country. But we obviously saw the still intentionality of those of that racism, and that lives and breathes in our code, as you said. I want to turn to you, Paul, because as a advisory council member, you wrestled with these thousands of pages and the comments, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit also about, from your perspective, what do you see as most important in the recommendations, and what's your hope of how this potentially could see us end up in a better place, at least moving forward, hopefully, if the reforms are passed?
It was an honor to serve on the advisory board, and the hard work of the staff, including Richard and Patrice, would make you proud to be a citizen of the District of Columbia. It's really good government at its best. I have two reactions to the recommendations, one as a geeky law professor and the other as a Black male citizen of the District of Columbia, who many years ago was arrested for a crime that I didn't commit. And I went to trial, jury trial, for a misdemeanor. And I would not have that right to a jury trial now, unlike in virtually any other state. So my reaction as a geeky law professor is thank God for these revisions. Our criminal code has not had a comprehensive review or update since 1901. After the model penal code was ratified by the American Law Institute in the early 1960s, almost every state revised its criminal code in response. The District of Columbia did not, and finally now we're moving toward a criminal code that's worthy of our status. I tell my students that we have the best trial courts of any state in the country. We have the best public defender service in the United States. Our U.S. Attorney's Office is the most diverse. Our criminal code has been a hot mess. It's frequently unclear, it's confusing, it's contradictory. In one famous example, there's no statutory definition of manslaughter. And then the reaction as an African American. If you go to Superior Court in the District of Columbia today, or 25 years ago, if you go to Superior Court in the District of Columbia, you would think that white people don't commit crimes. White people are around 45% of the population of the District of Columbia, but they're utterly absent from the criminal court. You would think that white people don't use drugs, they don't get into fights, they don't steal, but Black people, man, those are some bad dudes. For everyone who understands that's not an accurate picture of the District of Columbia, the recommendations would make a dent, I think, in terms of making our Superior Court more just. So for example, the recommendations would end mandatory minimums, and they would expand jury demandability for misdemeanor. You would, again, like I, be able to have a jury trial if you're arrested for a misdemeanor, which again, are the vast majority of arrests in the District of Columbia. I'm also excited about the provision that applies the second chance procedures to everybody, regardless of how old they were at the time that they committed the offense. So I'm hoping that some of these measures will bring not equal justice under the law to the District of Columbia, because that would require even more transformation. But I'm hoping it's a step along the way to eradicating this picture of our criminal courts now that, as James and Patrice and others have pointed out, we don't even look like the new Jim Crow in DC. At this point, we look like the old Jim Crow.
Really appreciate that perspective, Paul. You know, when I listen to you as a former prosecutor and also someone who has, as you shared, experienced the system. And I wonder, Parissa, if I can turn to you now as a current prosecutor in our neighboring jurisdiction, and one who, as I understand it, really has worked to differentiate public safety and accountability from incarceration. Something that I think our laws in the district don't do at all, really, at this point. So I wonder if you could share a little bit from your perspective. Where do you see the need for system improvements, and how do you see some of the recommendations from the Code Reform Commission playing a role in hopefully pushing us more towards a system that at least gets closer, as Paul said, to being fair and just?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks everybody who's on the panel and for inviting me to this panel. I mean, I don't have specifics about what the code recommendations are necessarily, but some of them are things that similar to what I've been steeped in not only trying to do the work that I'm doing in the office, but also the advocacy work that we've been doing as sort of a group of reform prosecutors with the General Assembly in Virginia here. So, you know, I think about my approach to the job is sort of knowing that to prosecute is first, last, and always to exercise restraint and humility. And being a prosecutor comes with an extraordinary amount of power. And any office that is invested with so much power has to be tempered not just with personal humility, but also institutional restraint. And some of the laws that we have on the books, you know, both in DC and in Virginia and in other states, don't really do that. And so in terms of policies and for advocacy, the things that I've adopted are designed really to place institutional constraints on the office. So the reason to eliminate cash bail is good because we're eliminating our ability to jail people just because they can't pay their way out. And that places an institutional restraint on the office. The reason for abolishing the death penalty, which we finally did in Virginia this year, is that by eliminating our ability to charge a capital offense in order to coerce a plea, really, that places an institutional restraint on the office. The reason for abolishing mandatory minimums, which I applaud the recommendations, and we've been trying to do in Virginia for a few years. The reason to abolish those is because it eliminates our ability to automatically condemn people and to coerce them really with lengthy sentences. Even if we don't intend to, it still has that result. That places an institutional restraint on the office. The reason for supporting judge sentencing rather than mandatory jury sentencing, which we just got that change this year in Virginia as well, is exactly to place an institutional restraint on the office so that jury sentencing isn't used as a coercive tool to get people to plead. So, and from my perspective, I don't think I don't like being called, progressive, because I think that everybody should be for institutional restraint for prosecutors, regardless of whether you're a conservative or a liberal or libertarian. it's really about looking at sort of what we're comfortable, or how much power are we comfortable, unrestrained power, are we comfortable with prosecutors having? And I think that the conversations we're having around race and the fact that, you know, our codes are are really, as Patrice said, you know, derived from some pretty, you know, sort of historically bad and racist sources, but also to sort of addressing the false myth of Black dangerousness. It's really, really important to have those constraints on that prosecutorial power.
So, Patrice, I'm going to go to you to follow up on sort of what Patrice was just saying, and you're hearing, you know, a current prosecutor and a former prosecutor, and I see you over there nodding. As a former defense attorney, as I was as well, I dare say that Patrice and Paul may not be the represent the views of every prosecutor, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, from your perspective, both as a defense attorney working within the system, and I think about what Tyrone Walker talked about yesterday, the lack of clarity, right? When he talked about when he was a teenager, facing indefinite terms and things that were so hard to understand that even his attorney struggled to share with him what his sentence would be. I wonder if you can speak a little bit from your perspective about how these changes could potentially help with clarity and some more preciseness in a system that I think has been sorely lacking in that respect.
A couple of days ago, I was talking to the interns who are with us at DC Justice Lab for the summer, and I pulled up DC's current burglary statute and gave them 5 minutes to, mark up anything that was unclear. And within 5 minutes, they'd highlighted almost every word on the page. I mean, it's completely unintelligible. And to think about how hard that was for someone who is studying the law to understand. Just imagine how hard it is for someone that you're trying to explain whether they've committed an offense or not, and they don't speak English, or they don't read English well, or they haven't studied the law. It's incredibly unfair to the people who are governed by these laws. And even though that statute is so bad, it's been that bad for 50 years. I mean, that's a statute from, I think, 1973, the version of it that we have now. But the reason that it hasn't changed is not just that people want it to look like that, it's that it's really, really hard to rewrite it. It's hard to write a criminal statute in a way that it's clear and understandable, but also really precise. And so what you'll notice in the revised code is that we rely on a lot of statutory definitions. We have a lot of words used on the page that you can then cross-reference and really understand what those words mean better. And that helps us from having these long, 70-word long sentences aimed at trying to make the law precise, but still being able to be really clear and understand what the harm is that the law is actually trying to capture.
That's really helpful. I think everybody who was watching yesterday, as Tyrone described his, sort of the pain and struggle that he had in just understanding what was happening, can appreciate the need for our system to work in ways that and to have some clarity for folks. I'm going to turn back to you, Halim. As I understand it, you made yourself an expert on a very arcane statutory framework while you were incarcerated. You are now home and doing amazing things as a result of the Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act, which, as I understand it, would not have been retroactive if it had not been for your advocacy and your work. I wonder if you could talk a little bit, Halim, about the perspective of folks who are incarcerated, many of your brothers and sisters who are still there, and how this could impact them, the changes that are being talked about, elimination of mandatory minimums, second look for all, right? not just for those under the age of 18 and now under the age of 25? What impact will that have on folks? And why do you think it's important that we press forward with making these recommendations come into effect?
First and foremost, I want to address it's a gross misconception that people, whether they're innocent or guilty, who have committed or been convicted for violent crimes, that they have no remorse. They're these fatherless, godless, jobless, super predators. A lot of people who've been in this criminal legal system, especially from the District of Columbia, who serve out sentences in federal institutions all throughout the country. So many people don't have the opportunity to see their loved ones for decades, and they are hurting and they are remorseful. Those who have committed crimes, you know, a lot of them have been victims of violent crimes before they committed a violent crime. And it goes back to that fear I was saying. It takes a village to raise a child. And if you were a child who was raised in the district in the 80s and 90s, when we had the highest murder rates and rates of violence in the country, this is what the village presented you: fear and hurt and violence and despair. So a lot of them have come to an inner resolution about what they have done, the harm that they have caused, and they are eager to return back to society, to show society that they are not super predators, that they do have remorse, and they want to return to our communities and be violence interrupters and credible messengers, to be a part of the solutions that I'm blessed to speak about today. And the second part of the answer is those who find themselves currently incarcerated, oftentimes for decades. What this is going to do is give them hope. And that's one of the things I think about when President Obama ran for his election, and reading his book when I was in prison, The Audacity to Hope, that came from that sermon from Reverend Jeremiah Wright. And reading the book, that changed my perspective about my situation, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, when he was in the concentration camp. The hope that he, you know, those small glimmers of hope. And what this would do for our women and men who are incarcerated, it's going to give them hope. And that's what they need, not just to oftentimes to come back to society, but just to make it through in there, because being in the penal system is very cruel and unusual to the human spirit, just the way that it's operated and ran, especially when you consider you from the district and you're serving time in California, Oklahoma, and you don't get to touch and see your loved ones. So I think the greatest benefit that this will do, it will give them hope. And once they get the opportunity to return to society and sit where I sit today, these women and men will express their remorse for the harm that they have caused. And it won't just be an empty statement, that you will see them being credible messengers and violence interrupters and advocates and activists in the community, being a part of the solution that we're talking about today.
Well, I so appreciate that, Halim. You know, particularly, and you and I have had lots of conversations. The way you just explode those myths, right, about how people perceive you and others, both in terms of your views about the harm that was caused, but also the harm that you experienced as victims in a you know, what we talked about is sort of like a war zone growing up, and how the system treats people differently. I think I may come back to you on that, but thank you for lifting that up. I want to go back to you, Paul. You know, when you listen to Halim, I know you've been working in the district for a long time. You've prosecuted, you've been outspoken on how the system doesn't work for the community in a number of different ways. And I wonder if you can talk a little about, reflecting on what Halim was saying and the others, Patrice and Parissa, you know, your hopes for the future. Build a little bit on what you were saying earlier, and how these recommendations can at least start to lay a foundation for, you know, what we should be aspiring to.
So the aspiration is to ending systemic discrimination. The aspiration is to ending the anti-Blackness that's embedded in our law and politics. The aspiration is to get the District of Columbia from a place now where the life expectancy for a white woman is 12 years longer than the life expectancy for a Black woman, and the life expectancy for a white man is 17 years longer than for a Black man in our small town. That's unacceptable. This moment, not this revision project, but this focus on the criminal legal system has been inspired by the movement for Black Lives, which suggests that mass incarceration and these extraordinary race disparities are symptoms of larger social ills, including prominently white supremacy and patriarchy. And so we didn't set, as much as I would have loved to, on this revision process to end white supremacy and patriarchy. We can't do that with one cold revision, but what we can do is to reduce the collateral consequences for misdemeanors. We can make it easier for a young woman to get that arrest and plea off of her record, knowing the way that those things happen, which is that Black people don't drink in public. We don't jaywalk. We don't commit traffic infractions more than white people. I think, and I'll close here with the experience that my students have with an officer at the District of Columbia who invites them on a ride along to see what it's like to patrol the streets. And to demonstrate how much power he has, he plays a game with the students called Pick a Car. And the student is riding in the backseat of the car, and the officer says, point to any car you want and I'll stop it. He's a good officer. He waits until he has a legal reason, but he says that he can follow any car for 5 minutes, 3 or 4 blocks, and find a reason to stop it. And then he can order the passenger, the driver out of the car. He can request their consent to search. And none of what we're doing in the recommendations involve police practices per se, but there's a direct relationship between that extraordinary power and the thousands of misdemeanor arrests that happen to Black people every year in this city and do not happen to white people, even though white people, again, 45% of our city are just as guilty of those low-level petty offenses as whites, as Blacks. And so I think when it comes to the criminal legal process, what's good enough for white people is what's good enough for African Americans and for Latinx people.
Absolutely, Paul. I think back to my days at DYRS when you're talking about, we never had a white kid committed to the agency or at Oak Hill, not because there aren't white kids doing the types of things that we know happen, but it's just completely unequal justice. And it's not because we're not saying that kids for that should be locked up, but how can we do better for everyone? So, Patrice, I want to go back to you. Paul just really, powerfully sort of lifted up how this, the commission relates to other things that are going on within the larger community and system, that it's obviously not the answer to everything, but maybe can help because it does relate. I wonder if you could talk a little bit. You're wearing a different hat these days at the Justice Lab, and you're involved in so many different areas to try to push for change, whether that's police accountability, police reform, emerging adults, a whole range of issues. And I'm wondering if you could help us understand where the recommendations of the CCRC relate to that other bigger piece of work that we need to do, right? And why it's important that we keep pushing forward, but at least for the purposes of this discussion and what's going to happen soon, to make sure that the council takes this up and makes the changes. How does that relate to the other pieces of work that you and others are involved in to try to improve what's happening here in the district?
It certainly plays the role that Professor Butler mentioned with respect to policing, right? That the authority that we give police officers and also prosecutors, right, needs to be reined in somehow. We spent a lot of time talking about what people might consider fringe cases, right? Fact patterns that sound unlikely, right? Maybe they happen one every 100 times, maybe they happen one every 10 times, maybe they never happen at all. And you would hear people push back occasionally saying, well, how likely is that going to happen? Prosecutors certainly wouldn't prosecute a case like that. And that's wildly inconsistent with my experience as a defense attorney in this city. If you look at just the published opinions coming out of the DC Court of Appeals, it disproves that premise. They are arresting, prosecuting, litigating at trial, and defending on appeal, all kinds of conduct that is obviously not what anybody would have expected them to prosecute under a criminal statute. And so we can't continue to have these really broad laws that just trust and hope that system actors will apply and enforce them fairly. We really have to narrowly tailor it. And our criminal laws get used in other parts of the system, I think is important to point out as well, right? When people go litigate their own civil protection order cases, they're looking at the words on the page, even when prosecutors aren't using it. So every effort in DC that affects the criminal legal system is essentially a racial justice issue, because our system is entirely Black. And so I don't think there's any way to look at this in isolation, even though it wasn't explicitly a decarceration project or racial justice project. It's going to have an impact on that in DC. So I think it's one of the biggest parts of the work that that needs to happen this year, if not the biggest thing. It's so central to everything else.
So really pivotal in how we move forward holistically. This is what you're saying. This is, you can't separate this out. That's what I'm hearing. So Parissa, you just heard Patrice, talking about reining in the prosecutors, right? I wonder your thoughts as a current elected prosecutor when you hear about folks wanting to rein in and limit discretion and try to narrow the code a little bit. I know yesterday's speakers talked about sort of shrinking things, the size of the system. Could you talk a little bit about your perspective on that? And I understand, and I really appreciate that you talk a lot about community engagement in terms of these issues. So I wonder if you could reflect on what Patrice was saying and share your perspective as a prosecutor in this respect.
There's so many themes that I wanted to address based on this.
Don't be limited. Don't be limited by my question. Please jump in.
I mean, I think I campaigned on and have really sort of used as a mantra this notion of not just institutional and prosecutorial restraint, but of shrinking the system. And so I came into this office with a core set of beliefs, and really they've only been reinforced. And that's that, not every problem or not every social ill needs to be criminalized. Not every crime needs to be punished. Not every punishment has to result in incarceration, and not every instance of incarceration has to be so punitive and so dehumanizing that it makes no room for rehabilitation and redemption. So those are like my core sort of mantra that people who've heard me speak have heard me say a lot. But sort of a sibling to that mantra is the notion that and this is picking up on some of what Patrice was saying, is that, the criminal legal system is an extraordinarily blunt tool. And we have other kinds of tools that are less blunt. And, but, we continue to use this incredibly blunt tool that has extraordinarily high economic, social, and human and generational costs in spite of it. And I think it's worth pointing out that economically the costs are high because the system requires an extraordinary number of expensive primary actors: police, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, pretrial officers, sheriffs, probation officers, correction officers. And it requires an extraordinary and no less expensive army of secondary actors, including administrative staff, experts, and that sort of thing. And the only thing that as a country we spend more money on than prisons is war. So those are our two priorities in this country: war and prisons. And if that worked to make us safe, we would be the most safe society in human history. And we're not. So clearly, like this blunt tool that we're just sort of employing left and right is not functioning the way it's supposed to economically. Socially, when prosecution doesn't end in incarceration, a criminal record still poses a lifetime of risk of being shut out of a huge catalog of social goods and benefits, including the primary job market, security clearance, school loans, public housing. And all of this has an extraordinary economic and health impact on our communities. On a human level, coming into contact with the criminal legal system can be enormously and permanently disruptive of an individual's personal and family life, to the point where one minor prosecution can, or even contact, right, can mushroom, especially like we've seen that in the studies with like middle school kids, like even contact with law enforcement, it puts them at higher risk later on of actually being involved in crime. And then finally, the generationally rather, the system has never fallen equally on everyone, as both Mr. Flowers and Professor Butler have pointed out. And we know that it falls the hardest on Black and brown people and on poor people. And that's particularly true of the war on drugs. And so basically, like we have lots of different tools in our toolbox for regulating things that, as Professor Butler said, primarily white people do, primarily wealthy people do. But we've reduced our tool for other things to the criminal legal system. And I think the question that it doesn't mean that we have to tolerate behavior that the community finds undesirable. It's just that I think we should be asking ourselves, do we possess less blunt tools to deal with problematic behavior? And do we possess the tools, most importantly? And I think that we should never lose sight of this when we're talking about reforming the criminal legal system. Do we have tools that are preventative? Because if we can't just stop prosecuting and replace with nothing. We need to redirect our energies, I think, into things that actually prevent and address harms. And that, tends to be a whole variety of social programs, healthcare, housing, jobs, all of these other things. And we can't lose sight that these are interconnected issues, and that we need to build up as well as in order to have better tools in our toolbox.
Yeah. So this conversation is just so, I think, fascinating and valuable. I appreciate all the perspectives. I'm going to turn to Halim in just a moment for maybe the last word as we get close to time. But I appreciate everyone, the perspective and the way you're broadening this conversation and grounding it as well in the reality of the system of white supremacy that we operate under, and how these recommendations and this effort relates to the other things going on that touch on lives in our communities. I was struck, Halim, when Parissa was talking about the system being a blunt tool, right? And one that is extraordinarily costly. We spend, as she said, more on prisons and war than anything else, and doesn't do a good job and hits communities and people that look like you the hardest in ways that have devastating consequences for everyone. And so I wonder if you can help us think, Halim, a little bit more creatively. You talk about the myths, right? You talk about yourself and others being viewed as remorseless, and people who, it just ignores the fact that most people in prison have been victims of crime themselves. There was discussion earlier today on the previous panel about why don't we have more restorative options, right? That the IRA, I've heard this from Tyrone and you and others, there's no contact between somebody who's sent away for a long sentence and the people they harmed until maybe the day before the hearing, right? And how is that good for anybody? So I wonder if you could just, share with us your thoughts on how we could be more creative, how a system could look more restorative and fair and constructive in your view as we move forward.
Great. Definitely want to answer this in two parts and quickly, respect to time. Going back to what Parissa mentioned about war in prison. I remember before my incarceration, the ROTC or RTC at my high school was begging me to sign up for the Army because I was working out, and they saw that I had discipline and things of that nature. And I think about that, had I signed up, I probably would have went to war in Afghanistan eventually, because I was in that age bracket. And I would have went there and committed violent crimes, either there in Iraq. And when I returned back to society, being as though that we have a society that doesn't invest in healing people from trauma in our war zone communities that we grew up in these inner cities, I had a high probability of still ending up in the prison system. Because when you look at how we treat our veterans, when they return back from these war zones, oftentimes it's not a safety net in place to provide them with the right nurturing that they need to heal from the trauma. And they end up committing another crime of violence or a crime other than a misdemeanor, definitely a felony, just to cope or try to survive with a society that progresses while they were away in the war zone, and they end up in the criminal legal system, as I saw so many veterans in there when I was serving those 22 years of incarceration. And the second answer to that question, what it's going to take, and this goes off the first response, is that, as Parissa mentioned, that it's other entities in the communities, housing, education. Even for me, I'm in the process of starting my own venture capitalist firm to be able to take these ultra high net worth art collectors that purchase my art and the relationships that I build with them, often hedge fund and private equity people, and to create a fund for returning citizen entrepreneurs, create a fund for young people like me who took my pre-SATs when I was 11, but my family was intergenerationally steeped in poverty that made me to start selling crack, or not didn't make me, but persuaded me to start selling crack at the age of 12 to pull myself up by my own bootstrap with no boot to begin with. So creating the boot and creating the strap, even though it was illegal and immoral trade, but feeling this pressure as a child that the only way I'm going to escape this war zone and escape not being a victim of violence or mass incarceration is to make money to do like most prestigious Black folks do in DC, to move to PG County, right, where it's more safer. So I think that we all have to get together, the clergymen, the law enforcement, the politicians, the ex-offenders, or whatever title we returning citizens want to put on them. And we all want to have to humble ourselves, sit as we're sitting down, be open-minded, and have the willingness to share our truth and then reconciliate from that truth. So we definitely are in need of a truth and reconciliation process that's comprehensive and not just exclusive to prosecutors and legislators and law enforcement and correctional unions, but all of the people who we say that we want to have a safety for the public, and then all come together and build on that foundation of truth and open-mindedness to listen, to understand, and not to respond, and then create a new process and a new institutional system that is built on love and not fear for public safety, and to have that where it's a comprehensive solution where everyone has an opportunity to contribute to say what public safety looks like in my community, because the people that you're removing are from my zip code and not yours, right? And they're going to return to my zip code and not yours. So they should have definitely a say-so in how individuals are treated that are being removed and returned to their zip code.
Well, I think you just said it so well. I mean, it's gonna, that vision of folks coming together, including around things like this commission reform recommendations. People should be weighing in, the community should be sharing their views, right? And so I appreciate the perspective, you and all the speakers, of just keeping it real. I'm reminded as you were talking, Halim, the way James Foreman opened it up yesterday and really framed it that we can do better, and we've had a lack of imagination in the past, and some real intentional racism, obviously, that got us to a point where we are today. There has been progress. Halim, you and I were talking just earlier today about, and James talked about it yesterday, a historic moment last night, where we have an elected ANC commissioner, your friend and colleague, Joel Caston, who was elected to represent his constituents at the jail. So DC, I think, can lead and can show that we can start to the process of repairing the harm. But it's one thing, a hell of a lot of work.
One thing, Mark, not just the jail, but also the residents in the new high-end condominium complex across from the jail too.
Which Joel and I were talking this morning about how can we get him a residence there that's provided as part of his office. So we're going to work on that. So you're absolutely right. He wants to continue to represent that larger community. Well, we could go on for a lot longer with this group. Clearly, thank you so much, Paul, Parissa, Patrice, and Halim, for lending your time and your wisdom. And we look forward to keeping you as part of this. I'm sure you will be moving forward. And with that, thank you again. Thank you to all who listened today. I'm going to turn it back over to Richard Schmeckel and thank Richard as well for him and his team's work, tireless, really doing amazing. I see Patrice applauding over there. I'll applaud you, Patrice, as well, as a former member of that team. But thank you, Richard, for helping to give us something to work with moving forward, and hopefully we'll encourage the council to take this up and turn this into reality. So with that, thanks again for having JPI be a part of this, and I'll turn it to Richard now.
Yes, thank you all. And again, Mark, thank you for leading this panel. Thank all of you, Paul, Parissa, Halim, Patrice, great discussion. And yeah, thank you all for watching. If this discussion has you fired up, you're interested in some action, you're interested in learning more, you have a unique opportunity this coming year. The CCRC expects to introduce in the fall a bill with its reform recommendations. And we hope and expect that Councilmember Allen and the Judiciary Public Safety Committee will take that up and hold some hearings on the bill this fall. So it's an incredible, unique opportunity to weigh in on this piece of change. Again, as many have said, this is just a piece of the puzzle that has to be taken care of. If you want to read more about the CCRC recommendations or want to look at or share the video for this event, please come over to the CCRC website at ccrc.dc.gov. Again, that's ccrc.dc.gov. And it might take us a day, but we'll get up there links to the video. And again, we already have up there like the full set of recommendations, that massive as they are. Please check it out. And again, tune back in this fall when we expect there to be more consideration and legislative discussion kind of opens up more about these matters. So that's it for now. Thank you all. Really appreciate your time. And we hope to keep you engaged on this.